My name is Craig Uden. I'm a cattleman from south central Nebraska, a cow-calf operator and a commercial feedlot owner, and currently serve as Vice President of National Cattlemen's Beef Association. I'm pleased to welcome you to NCBA's webinar on what we think is a very important topic, new tools in bull selection. As we look at producer education, it brings a positive value of being a member of NCBA. National Cattlemen's Beef Association likes to stay engaged and helps bring current issues and topics to producers, as well as the speakers to address them. As a participant tonight, your line will be muted, but feel free to type in questions in the chat box on your screen, and at the end of this presentation, questions will be moderated to our presenters by Josh White, who is part of the NCBA producer education team. If you have trouble with your technology or you're joining us only for the audio, this webinar is being recorded and will be available by the end of the week at beefusa.org. With several speakers joining us across the country, bear with us as we change control of the presentation during the course of the webinar. There will be a brief pause in the discussion. We think we have an outstanding set of speakers who will provide the most up-to-date information on beef cattle selection indexes. Our speakers tonight include Dr. Wade Schaefer, CEO of the American Cital Association, Jack Ward, COO and Director of Breed Improvement for the American Herford Association. And tonight I'll start our panel with Dr. Dan Mosier, who is President of Angus Genetics, Inc. and Director of Performance Programs for the American Angus Association. Dr. Mosier.
Thank you, Craig. All right. As we begin tonight, first off, I want to thank Craig and thank Josh White with the NCBA producer education staff for making this opportunity possible. I think this is a great opportunity for us to work directly with a lot of producers all over the country and hopefully provide some information that will be useful to them as they think about their breeding programs, certainly commercial producers and maybe a few seed stock producers as well. So I'm going to lead off tonight and talk a little bit about sire selection in general using dollar values or dollar indexes, and then I'll talk specifically about some of the Angus values that we provide before handing off to some of the other speakers. I thought it was interesting that we described or titled this as new tools in bull selection because to some extent these are fairly new. They've not been around as long in the beef industry as some of the other tools that we have like EPDs, but we have had them around in the Angus breed for about 10 years, and so a lot of our producers have become familiar with them, but we continually get questions about these and how the best way to make use of this with other information to make the most effective sire selection. When I think of selection indexes, I think the idea is to combine lots of different sources of information in a very simple format. That the idea is to combine the genetic information on the bulls in this case that you might be considering, all the different trait EPDs, and of course the EPDs are fed by the data, the pedigrees, and in some cases the genomics that are behind them as well. Combining that with economic information about the costs and revenues associated with beef cattle production to really make selection simpler. That we're all faced with more and more information bombarding us in some cases, and taking a lot of different points of information and weighting them appropriately to give us a single number or just a few numbers that really describe the economic merit of a particular animal is really a pretty desirable sort of thing. This technology, as I mentioned, has been around for a long time, since the 1940s, that this technology has been used initially heavily by the poultry industry, the swine industry, and the dairy industry, and then about 10 years ago it worked its way into the beef cattle selection realm as well. But the goal here is to weight the traits appropriately because it is difficult for any producer to make that decision on their own to say how many pounds of weaning weight is worth how much calving ease or how much milk or carcass quality, those sort of things. Lots of different traits with lots of different economic levels of importance. This technique allows us to weight those things appropriately and help us identify the most profitable animal in our operation. But as we start off looking at selection indexes or dollar values, that generally these will fall into two categories in the beef cattle industry: terminal indexes and maternal indexes. So terminal indexes are designed to predict profit under a terminal situation where the bulls are being used to produce feeder or ultimately fed cattle, but without any consideration of maternal traits, because in this sort of scenario, none of the females will be retained. And so generally the traits that get most priority in these particular indexes would be growth and carcass merit. An example of that, in the Angus breed, we have a value called beef value, or $B. Jack will talk later about CHB, or Certified Hereford Beef Index, and Wade will talk about Terminal Index and Cital. They all try to do basically the same thing, to identify the sires that are most profitable when they're used to produce feeder cattle and fed cattle. We also have maternal indexes that fit a lot of producers' operations where they're retaining heifers as well as marketing the steers as either feeder or fed cattle. So an example of that in Angus would be $W, or wean calf value. Hereford has BMI, or balding maternal index. Cital has API, or all-purpose index. Those are all designed to predict profit using a lot more traits, because not only does it consider the terminal traits we talked about, it still takes into account growth, because we know that the steer calves and the cull heifers, the ones that don't merit being retained as replacements, are still going to be marketed as either feeder cattle or fed cattle. But we also need to consider the maternal traits, because we know that we're going to keep heifers in this particular scenario. And so things like reproductive rate, milk production, cow cost, all those sort of things come in as well. So these are a bit more sophisticated. Generally, they include a lot more traits than the terminal indexes, but they strive to identify the most profitable sires for what's probably the most common scenario for cow-calf producers. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the specific Angus dollar values that you may have seen. In the Angus breed, we offer several terminal values. The primary one is $B, or beef value. And $B is a value that assigns differences in sires, assuming that the progeny out of those sires is going to be sold as fed cattle. So it's weighting things like feedlot performance, rate of gain, but also feed intake. Feed efficiency is also a consideration, where we have feed intake values as part of our genetic evaluation, and sires with the genetic advantages for lower feed intake relative to their performance also get credited with higher beef values. And then certainly carcass value is also a component of that, quality grade, yield grade, all those grid factors going in. So beef value is a sort of an all-encompassing index for producers that are using Angus bulls as terminal sires, or wanting to understand the differences in value between two sires based on those sort of assumptions. We have another value called feedlot value, or $F, and $F is somewhat similar to $B, except it doesn't take into account the differences that you would gain from marketing cattle on a value-based grid, fed cattle on a value-based grid. That feedlot value basically rewards feedlot performance and basically assumes that the cattle are being sold in live weight in a cash market as opposed to a value-based grid. So the primary traits included in feedlot value would then be yearling weight, carcass weight, those sort of performance measures, and also feed efficiency, again, is included in $F. The third terminal value we have is grid value, or $G, and it's one that really focuses in on grid premiums, on the premiums that you would get from higher quality grades, higher percent of premium choice like certified Angus beef, as well as higher percent choice over the select market. So it's going to be focusing heavily on marbling, as well as factors that influence carcass yield grade, like ribeye area, fat thickness, carcass weight, those sort of things. And it even has subcomponents for qualities, for quality grade and yield grade, so you can see the dollar differences between sires for those two components. On the maternal side, Angus has a value called wean calf value, or $W, and this is one that fits the production circumstances of a lot of folks that are using Angus bulls in commercial herds. That wean calf value defines profit differences between sires, and again, all these units are dollars per calf sired, so the dollar differences are on that scale, but it's assigning profit differences in progeny due to pre-weaning performance. So it's taking into account traits like weaning weight, milk, calving ease, and then cow cost. And we break out the cow cost as a separate value, a separate index called $EN that I'll talk about in a second. $EN, or cow energy value, specifically pinpoints the cow cost differences that are projected in different lines of genetics. And it's expressed in dollars of savings. So even though it's talking about costs, the higher values represent higher savings for bulls with higher $EN values. So it's expressed in dollars per cow per year as an expected additional savings in the daughters of the bulls that you might be considering. And I know we have a lot of commercial producers that use $EN as kind of a threshold value, particularly if they're in an environment where they have fairly limited feed resources, where they want to make sure that $EN doesn't go below a certain amount, because $EN is really a reflection of traits like mature cow size and milk production. We know that as cow size goes up and milk goes up, the feed cost associated with those cows, or the energy cost, goes up. And so $EN is just a predictor of whether the daughters of any particular sire will be higher or lower cost cows when you put them in the cow herd. We have a couple other selection tools we have on our website, www.angus.org. One of them is called Optimum Milk Module, where it lets you put in some values about your own operation and identify the appropriate level of milk, or the profit maximizing level of milk for your particular beef herd. And then we also have the opportunity to customize these dollar values if you have a unique marketing system, if you have very detailed information about your cow costs, your labor costs, different ideas about what you think the future of marketing might be, different choice select spreads. There's the opportunity to go in and customize these and produce your own values based on your own situation. So to give you an example of how these values might work, let's consider a couple of bulls. We'll call them sire A and sire B. Sire A has a $W value of 50 and a $B value of 85. Sire B, on the other hand, has a $35 value for $W and 105 for $B. So under one scenario, if we're going to use these bulls as rotational sires, we're going to use them in a commercial operation where we're going to keep daughters out of these bulls. We're going to sell calves at weaning, for example. Then the most appropriate index to use in selection then would be $W. $W does just that. It figures profit differences when heifers are retained and when the steers and the excess heifers are sold as weaned calves. And so in this case, the most profitable bull in this scenario should be sire A, and the difference should be $15 per calf, because he has a $15 higher value for $W than sire B. And that profit difference is coming from heavier calves at weaning on the calves that we sell, lower cost cows on the females that we retain due to lower mature size, lower levels of milk, and then greater calving ease, which lowers labor cost as well as shortens rebreeding interval and those sort of things when we have greater calving ease. But if we have a terminal situation where we're looking at Angus bulls and we want to use these to produce primarily fed cattle, and we want to see the differences in the value of the fed cattle, then $B is the more appropriate index. So if we're going to retain ownership on all the calves, we're not going to keep any heifers, we're going to feed them all out, sell them on a grid, then $B is the most appropriate index. And you can see in this situation, sire B would have the higher value for the $B index, and thus he'd be the most profitable, and we'd expect an additional $20 of profit per calf sired, 105 for sire B versus 85 for sire A. So again, that's coming from the fact that he has EPDs for higher growth, higher carcass weight, higher marbling perhaps, more desirable quality and yield grade, and also greater feed efficiency based on the feed intake data that we have in our evaluation. So if you think about selection indexes in a way to put these into use in your own operation, as we start, as you may be out looking for bulls to buy for your operation this spring, the first step is to find the index that best fits your production scenario. Is it a maternal index or is it a terminal index? And some breeds allow you to specify within that. For example, our terminal indexes, are you going to sell cattle on a grid or are you going to sell them in the cash market? Then the first step after that is to focus primarily on the index values. Do a sort among the bulls that you might be considering for an index like $W. Once you've identified bulls that have higher, more desirable values for that trait, then you probably want to do some detailed selection to make sure all the traits fit within your range. You may want to, for example, set a minimum level of $EN. You may want to set a threshold on calving ease, where you need to have a certain level of calving ease, particularly if you're going to use the bulls on heifers. With that, we will take questions at the end of the presentation, so if you're taking some notes, or you can type questions into the chat box window. But at this time, I'm going to hand over the presentation to Jack Ward. Jack is the Chief Operating Officer and the Director of Breed Improvement for the American Hereford Association. So if you bear with me just a second, I will pass off to Jack.
Okay, thank you, Dan, and I appreciate the opportunity also to speak with the crowd tonight. And Dan did a wonderful job of giving some background on profit indexes, and later on, I think you're going to find some interesting information from Wade about the history of what we've done in terms of increasing production in the beef cattle industry here in the U.S. with our current tools. Such as EPDs, and I'd like to touch on that just a little bit as we start here and talk about the progress that we have made in terms of maximizing some of our growth, milk, some end product, if you will, by the current tools that we have in the EPDs, and the EPDs do a wonderful job in allowing us to predict differences in phenotype between future groups of progenies. And yet, sometimes when we think about this, we need to think about if we continue to chase one particular trait or a single trait, the antagonisms that are associated with that. For instance, we put a lot of emphasis on calving ease. Obviously, that's an economically relevant trait that none of us want to have any issues with calving ease. But as we continue to chase that, what do we lose in terms of potential growth potential? Perhaps on end product if we continue to chase muscle, or in some cases even marbling. What do we do in terms of losing some maternal qualities in our cow herd? And again, then if we just chase growth and to continue to chase just weaning and yearling weight, what do we do in terms of cow size and feed requirements, as Dan spoke about, and even in the area of milk production. If we just continue to chase a lot of milk, what does that do in terms of our feed requirements and our resources needed? So with that said, I think we obviously, as Dan said, for the last 10 years, many of the beef breed associations have worked very hard at providing customers an opportunity to kind of do some multi-trait selection, if you will, and using economically relevant traits in various production systems. And as Dan told you, these dollar indexes, we make the same comparison with a dollar index as we would with an EPD when we looked at comparables. Beef breed associations will provide you a breed average for these various dollar values for you to look at as well. So the way you compare animals is exactly the same, and it gives us an opportunity to put it on an economic value or a profitability value, if you will, and not so much about maximizing just production. So how do they work? Again, we talk about maximizing profit in a particular situation. I think it's always interesting at times producers, I know even at our household, sometimes we get so taken back by the fact that our calves weighed a little more than they did a year ago, and maybe even quite a bit more than they did 2 or 3 years ago. But what did we give up in terms of profitability as we chased some of that at times? And so the economic indexes allow us as producers to select animals with the most favorable combination of EPDs, as Dan said, and the same for Herford and Cital. We use a multi-trait approach to this. So we could call them, honestly, we call them dollar indexes. We could call them profitability EPDs, if you will. As Dan mentioned in his presentation, this just predicts, or these dollar indexes allows us to predict the differences among sires and future profit derived from their progeny. And it emphasizes the relative economic contribution of each trait to profit. So as Dan said, we put a relative weighting on those traits, and we combine that with a dollar figure to come up with these dollar indexes. At this point, the process, I'd like to talk a little bit at Herford. We owe a lot of gratitude to Mike McNeil. At the time was at Miles City and currently with Delta Genetics. He helped us develop our indexes. Dr. Don Boggs, who at the time, again, when we started this process, was at South Dakota State University and is now at K-State. Dr. Vern Pierce was the economist that we looked at, and obviously we had to look at our staff and our board of directors, and especially the Breed Improvement Committee. This was an interesting challenge for us, and it was very interesting to look at things because it was based off of profit and what is truly important in these various production systems, and so it kind of makes you step back and take a look. So Mike looks at these and puts them into, or as we develop these performance, these indexes, it's in a simulated production system. We determine the difference among our sires that we use in the various traits at Herford through whole herd reporting. We've been doing that since 2000, and as Dan mentioned earlier, we also now have a genomic component added to our EPDs, and so those traits are enhanced from that standpoint. We combine the genetic evaluations and then put the relative economic values to rank the sires, and that's how we come up with our selection indexes. So I'd like to just go briefly over the four basic dollar indexes that we developed here at Herford, and as Dan spoke to you, these are very specific to a particular program, a different part of the country, what your goals are within your program. We have a Baldy maternal index, as Dan said, very similar to their dollar weaning that is more of a maternal index. Calving ease is pretty simply just when you're using Hereford bulls in a heifer program. We understood the need for our Gulf Coast customers that wanted to use Hereford bulls in Brahma influenced and Boss Indicus programs, that we could provide them an index for their needs. And then, as Dan mentioned to you earlier, our terminal index using Hereford bulls strictly to raise feedlot and carcass cattle is called certified Hereford beef. So our Baldy maternal index is really an interesting one and a real true multi-trait index. It's an index used to maximize profit for a cow-calf producer that's using Hereford bulls in a crossbreeding program, basically Angus-based or English-based. And we want you to retain, or they're going to want to retain ownership in the calves through the feedlot phase, and we're going to market them on a CHB grid. So this is kind of an interesting one because we are going to retain females, potentially replacements in this index. So calving ease is obviously important. We want those calves to grow very quickly through weaning and to a year of age, and then we want them to stop because those females that we're retaining, we don't want to get the cow size too big. We have an interesting negative relative weighting on milk, as Dan mentioned earlier. Milk production, not only the production of milk itself through the lactating phase is tough and it requires a little more input, but also those cows that have the genes for more milk require a little more maintenance, and so that we have a relative negative weighting there. And then obviously we want them to perform well on the rail, both ribeye and quality grade, and our grid is set up with a little more emphasis on quality grade in this particular index. So it's really a very interesting index, multi-trait, and perhaps I should tell you that this one is heavily weighted on the most important economic factor in the commercial cow herd, and that's fertility. And right now, the big driver in that is scrotal, and we are in the process of developing some more fertility traits that will be added into this index in the near future. Calving ease, as we said, is real simple. It's using Hereford bulls on heifers, so obviously a huge weighting on calving ease in this particular one, both direct and maternal. Our Brahma Influence Index, as I said, is geared obviously towards the Bos Indicus Brahma Influence cattle, and it's very similar to our our Balding Maternal Index, except we replace Angus with the Brahma or Bos Indicus cattle, and we put even more emphasis on fertility and puberty here. So scrotal circumference is a huge driver in this one. And again, not as much emphasis on calving ease as maybe in the Balding Maternal, because this Bos Taurus and Brahma-based cow doesn't have as much trouble at that stage. And again, heavily weighted more towards marbling than ribeye, but both of those factors are involved in this dollar index as well. And then finally, our final index is the terminal one, and that is certified Hereford beef. And as Dan said, we wouldn't be retaining any females in this index as we use it and use it in our crossbreeding system. So what we want is for these cattle to obviously be born easily, so there's some weight on calving ease, and then we really want them to grow at all stages of a production, from weaning to yearling. We sell these cattle in this index on the CHB grid, and obviously we care nothing about milk or fertility in this index, again, because we're not going to be retaining any females as replacements. If you're selecting here to use Hereford bulls on your cows with just simply an in-product feedlot merit to it. So those are the 4 indexes that we have, and again, most all of them are multi-trait and kind of all-encompassing with 2 or 3 maternal indexes and then the 1 terminal. So at this time, I will, as Dan mentioned, we'll have questions asked at the end through your chat room with Josh. And again, I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you, and it's my pleasure to turn it over to Dr. Wade Schaefer, the Chief Executive Officer of the American Cital Association.
Hey Wade, this is Josh interrupting here. I'm not picking up any audio. If you're on.
Sorry about that. Sorry, I'm on. Yep.
There we go. All right.
I was talking to myself. I guess I had it on mute. So anyway, I want to reiterate what the previous speakers mentioned. It is a privilege to speak to this group tonight. It's not very often get a chance to talk to as many true cattlemen as we will tonight. Also like to commend our prior speakers, Dan and Jack, on a great job of conveying the information. I am going to start with what I call a cattle breeding commandment. I only have 2 of them, so in my book, cattle breeding is pretty straightforward, only requires 2 major things. One I'm going to talk about tonight, the commandment is, thou shalt select superior sires. And that's pretty intuitive, pretty much common sense. We're all wanting to select superior sires. In fact, I've never talked to anyone that purposely went out to select inferior sires. That said, I would opine that quite frequently we don't do as good of a job of selecting sires as we could. We're not oftentimes leveraging all the tools and the information that we have in our toolbox. So I will, as the previous speakers did, I will walk us through this new tool that we have in our toolbox, or at least it's relatively new to us. So I like to when I talk about selecting sires, you've got to start, the first step where we start is predicting genetic level. And I liken that to a card game, a big poker game, or blackjack, what have you, where you've got several hands laying around on the table. Each one of those hands is very similar to a sire, a young sire. And a lot of times, some of those cards are facing up. Many of those cards are facing down. So we are attempting to determine, make some assessment on the value of each one of those hands, and very much the same way we attempt to assess value on a set of sires. Now, there's a couple of ways we can play cards. We can play poker. We can play poker like the Rain Man. For those of you that remember, years ago, there was a movie that came out, and the Rain Man was an autistic savant who could count cards. And he had such an advantage in playing cards that they actually kicked him out of the casino. He just had a huge advantage. The other way you can play cards is how I typically play cards, pretty much like Elmer Fudd. You just kind of take a shotgun approach to card playing. And when we tie that back to sire selection, specifically to predicting genetic level, if we play the game of sire selection like the Rain Man, we're using EPDs. If we do anything else, we're playing the game, we're selecting or determining genetic level, much like Elmer Fudd. We have known for many decades that EPDs, if what you're after is predicting genetic level for whatever trait we are calculating them on, EPDs are far and away the most accurate estimate of an animal's genetic level. So I can't emphasize this any more strongly. We absolutely need to use EPDs to predict genetic level. No ifs, ands, or buts about that. So that said, question is, well, okay, so I bought into using EPDs. I know they are the best estimate of genetic level, but boy, there's a lot of them. Most breeds have 15, 20, even more EPDs. And as Jack said, obviously, sire is not, we don't value a sire on a single trait. The value of a sire is how they size up in a number of traits, and somehow we have to juggle all this information, all these prediction of genetic levels, and make some sense out of it. So what do we do? What do we do? Well, we chart a direction. We chart a direction. We all do this. When we're making selection decisions, we all chart some direction. Some people might put it on paper. Some people just do it in their head. Some people are just winging it as bulls come through the sale barn. Okay? But we all chart some direction, and I would offer this up. The typical direction we chart is more output. As Jack said, more of everything. More growth, more milk, more. Well, the question becomes, is more better? Are we actually, by selecting for more, are we getting at a superior sire? Okay, well, we know that you could take a field of corn and you can put fertilizer on that field of corn, and you can continue to increase the level of fertilizer on that field of corn, and you'll probably get more production. You'll get more output. But at some point in time, that extra output is going to be outweighed by the extra cost of the fertilizer. So there is a better way to go about selection than unmitigated selection for output, and that is, of course, well, first of all, as I show there with the Wile E. Coyote there and the Roadrunner, we can end up in places that we don't want to be, and most of you probably can relate to this, with unmitigated selection for output, we can certainly end up in places we don't want to be. Now, what's a better approach? Well, as previous speakers have mentioned, selecting for profit. Selecting for profit makes much more sense than simply selecting for output. And if we do it right, if we do things appropriately, if we select for profit appropriately, we end up getting what we're after, and that is the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. If you're in this business to make money, profit should be what you're selecting for. So how do we do that? How do we select for profit? Well, when we talk about biological traits, we pretty much all know how to do that. If we want to select for calving ease, if we want to select for marbling, if we want to select for more growth, we know how to do that. We measure it. We use scientific methodology to calculate EPDs, and we get the best estimate we can possibly get when it comes to genetic level. But when it comes to selecting for profit, that seems pretty different. We're not used to that. So what do? Well, we do what we do when we select for biological traits. We measure it. We have to measure it. Now, it's a little bit different. We have to think in terms of an accountant would think. We have to think in terms that an accountant would think if we're going to measure profit. But it's pretty straightforward. Actually, we all know this, and we don't have to be an accountant to know this. We know that profit is simply dollars of output minus the dollars of input it took you to make that output. Okay? Like I said, you don't need to be an accountant to understand that. Pretty straightforward. So, fortunately, in the world of animal breeding, as Jack and Dan had mentioned, we have these things called economic selection indexes. And really all they are is genetic accounting. It's that equation. We're putting that equation into practice. Profit equals dollar output minus dollar input. And the title of our seminar tonight is New Selection Tools. Well, as Dan had alluded to, it's really aren't new. In fact, back in 1943, a fellow named Lenoy Hazel, who was at Iowa State, or actually it was Iowa A&M, I believe, at the time, came up with the seminal paper introducing the methodology required to develop economic selection indexes. And from that point in time, it's my understanding that the poultry industry, within the first decade, started to pick up on the idea of the economic selection index. Probably a decade or two later, pig industry, and around that same time, the dairy industry came on board. And I think you'd be hard-pressed now to find a chicken, a pig, or a dairy animal that wasn't bred through the use of an economic selection index. Now, you might find some banty rooster at the county fair, but if you're into serious commercial production of any of those species, they are bred through the use of an economic index. So our indexes, as both Jack and Dan had mentioned, ASA has a couple of indexes. We developed those in collaboration with USDA. Mike McNeil, as Jack had mentioned, at Fort Keele. And also, that's the biological side. The economic side, the prices and costs that are required for these things were largely derived from cattle facts models that predicted those things. And so we have an all-purpose index, or an API, and terminal index. And both of these indexes are indexes for a fully integrated system that covers everything that a sire would impact if used in the all-purpose situation, if used to keep replacement females, when the rest of the animals, the cull heifers and steers, go into the feedlot and they're sold grade and yield. The terminal index is, as you would expect, you're going to use that sire, mature cows, 3-year-old plus cows, and the resulting offspring, 100% of them are going to go into the feedlot and be sold grade and yield. We have, obviously, we have had people question why do you just have 2 indexes? We know that a good share of commercial producers sell their calves at weaning. Well, we just felt, I guess our philosophy was that, sure, so if we have commercial producers that are selling their calves at weaning, they in theory can wash their hands of those calves post-weaning, but we just felt that we'd be derelict in our duties as far as developing population-wide indexes if we would ignore any phase of that production cycle that a sire would impact. So to give you a little bit, maybe to pull back the curtain a little bit, I think some people have a sense that like EPDs, these indexes are just more hocus-pocus kind of black box kind of stuff. But as the previous speakers mentioned, it's really straightforward stuff. We're just tying biology, genetics, and economics. And to pull the curtain back a little bit, so as I mentioned, our indexes cover all 3 phases of a production, or the cattle production system, cow-calf, feedlot, and packing plant. So if we take a look at API, and that's our index where we're keeping replacement females and the rest of the cattle are going into the feedlot, sold grade and yield, we've got this equation. On one side, it's the profit we're predicting. So the profit equals some output traits, a set of output traits, and then we have to subtract off a set of input traits. Okay, so we've got that infrastructure in place. So if we focus on this cow-calf end of things, a couple of output traits that have an impact on the cow-calf business, the cow-calf phase of the cow-calf enterprise. We have calf survival and weaning weight. Okay, and we know if we're an accountant, if we have those 2 things, we can calculate the amount of calf product that's coming out of the cow-calf enterprise. So, for instance, if we have 100 cows, we have a survival rate of 95%. Obviously, we have 95 calves. And if we know they weigh 550 pounds, if we're an accountant, we can do the math, of course. All of us can do the math, obviously. And we can come up with the pounds produced by the cow-calf enterprise. Now, some of you might be scratching your head and saying, boy, where does that, we know weaning weight, you've got an EPD for weaning weight, but where in the world do you get calf survival from? Well, calf survival comes from traits that are strongly correlated to it, specifically calving ease and maternal calving ease, as Jack had mentioned earlier. So we know that the genetic correlation between calving ease and maternal calving ease and calf survival relatively strong, and we use that to predict calf survival. So every animal in the database, even though we don't publish it, actually has an EPD for calf survival. So another factor that affects so we've got calving ease and maternal calving ease. Another factor that affects salvage weight, or affects the cow-calf phase, is salvage weight. And we get at that through mature cow weight prediction. Now on the other side of the fence, looking at the input traits, cow herd intake. How much is that cow herd going to eat? Both in the replacement heifer development and the cow-calf, or the cow herd phase. How do we get at that? Well, if we know the genetic size of the cows and we know the milk production level of the cows, we can do a pretty decent job of predicting cow herd intake. What else do we need to know on the input side? The other input variable that's factored in is replacement rate. Okay, and we get at that through our stability EPD, and we know that if you have a high replacement rate, in other words, if you're an accountant and you're looking at length of productive life of your cows, if you have long productive life, your replacement rate is lower and you can sell more pounds of calf product out of your cow-calf enterprise. If you have a, that's if you have a low replacement rate, rather, you'll have the ability to sell more pounds out of your calf product, and vice versa, of course, when it comes to replacement rate. So if we go down, drill a little deeper, we move to the feedlot. We see feedlot gain. Okay, we get at feedlot gain. We all actually have, we don't publish it directly, but all breed associations publish indirectly feedlot gain. In order to get that, you can calculate average daily gain simply by subtracting your weaning EPD off of your yearling EPD and dividing by 200 or 160 rather, and that's because your post-weaning phase, your 205 to 365 days is 160 days. So if you do that, you will get the differences you would expect between animals and average daily gain. And if you know how long the feeding period is, that gives you your entire feedlot gain. Over on the input side, feedlot intake. We don't get a lot of data where we get actual feedlot intake of individual animals. We do get some. By and large, this is being predicted with the growth curve. If we know birth, weaning, yearling, mature size, and then some proxy for body composition, we get that through carcass traits, we can do a relatively decent job of predicting feedlot intake. So then we move down into the packing plant. We've got yield grade, we've got that EPD, marbling, and dressing percentage. Some of you might be surprised to see dressing percentage there. We actually don't publish an EPD for that. We predict it using other traits, but the reason I have dressing percentage there is because if you take weaning weight and then add post-weaning gain in the feedlot, that gives you live weight at kill, and then of course to get carcass weight you need to have a dressing percentage. So that's how that all fits together. And when it comes to input traits at the packing plant, we really don't have any that are under genetic control that we would consider input traits. Now, if we're to look at this in a little bit different lens, if we look at this, of course we have to take prices and costs in order to make any sense of this. Just by themselves, they're biological traits, and we can get genetic levels for those, but we obviously have to have prices and costs. But if we were to look at this in terms of the terminal index, then we would need to go through here and remove the traits that a terminal sire would have no impact on. The obvious one on the output side is salvage weight. The terminal sire only sires calves that go to the feedlot. You're not keeping replacement females, so the cull weight of your females is immaterial in the terminal sire. And then over on the right-hand side, cow herd intake and replacement rate are not relevant. So really put all together, when you break it down, the economically relevant traits that we deal with are relatively few. We're only talking 10 total traits that pretty much covers the entire gamut in beef cattle production. You could throw in a few here or there. One I would throw out, if we could quantify it well, would be male fertility. If we had some way to get at that, and you could certainly come up with a few others. But by and large, if you're an accountant and you need to calculate profits, these traits, these are the traits that are under genetic control, and these are the traits that you would need if you were an accountant, and these are what we call economically relevant traits. And so now I'm going to throw out just an example of prices and costs, and I don't want you to even bother hardly looking at this. I'm just throwing this out to show you that there's a lot of information that we need as far as prices and costs in order to make, in order to predict profit. And that makes sense. I mean, if you're an accountant and you're wanting to predict profit in the enterprise, you're going to have to know all these things. Okay, now, one of the things I hear quite frequently is, hey, you know, those aren't exactly, those aren't the price for corn or your choice to select spread or your over and underweight carcass discounts. They're not what they are right now. Okay, and they're not on the money, so therefore your index must be flawed. Well, the fact of the matter is the absolute prices and costs are not highly relevant. Okay, for one, right up front, we can guarantee we're breeding cattle. When we breed cattle, we're breeding cattle for somewhere years down the road. And we know with virtual certainty we're not going to be right on the money. We might have been modeling corn at $4 and it might be $8 and it might be $3. So we're not going to be right on the money. We can guarantee you that. But what really is important is that these indexes will rank cattle correctly, and they are very robust as long as prices and costs are in relative equilibrium. So over time in a commodity, prices and costs are going to, sure, at one time or another, they might be way out of whack. The price of fat cattle might be way out of whack compared to the price of corn and the value of other inputs and outputs. But over time, these prices and costs will hit, or they will follow within a fairly tight window. And when that happens, because of that fact, these things are robust and they tend to work over time. And sure, if for 2 weeks the value of marbling goes to 0, say the value of choice to select spread is 0, well, obviously then your index, if it did weight marbling, is going to favor the heavier marbling bulls more than it should have for that 2-week period. But to think that those 2 weeks are going to be long-term, and you can't possibly breed cattle in a fashion where you're going to do something for a 2-week period or a short period. Over a long period of time, because prices and costs tend to flow in equilibrium, these things are quite robust. And so finally, I'll just close with this. As Dan and Jack had mentioned, these things are accepted universally by geneticists, these economic indexes of all the species out there that we compete with as the most effective way to improve profitability. So I'll just close with this. You really need to be using indexes. So with that, I close my portion of the presentation and pass the baton back to Troy, or Josh, I guess, yeah.
This is Craig, and I want to thank you, Wade, and I want to thank all our presenters tonight. This is one of the many things NCBA does best, to bring folks together from across the industry and provide this unique opportunity for cattlemen. And I think we've achieved those goals tonight, and I think it's been a great webinar. And I know as a cow-calf and feedlot operator and how I try to mesh things, it really added a lot of value for some things I need to look at. For those folks that were able to go to San Antonio and go to the Cattlemen's College, but we had a great presentation down there, and all the rooms were full, and people wish they could have went to other different seminars. If you missed one that you wanted to get to, for $20, you can get that seminar that you possibly missed, because there was a lot of different presentations that were very interesting, and there just wasn't enough time to hit them all. If you didn't get to go, $50 would be able to buy unlimited access to all the recordings that were presented at Cattlemen's College. So with that, as we move forward to the question and answer session, I want to share the opportunity for additional education. I want to pass it over here to Josh, and he is going to moderate the question and answer session. And I want to thank you for participating tonight. I think it was very worthwhile, and I hope everybody got a lot out of it. Very complex industry we're in, and a lot of tools and a lot of changes. And to keep one step ahead, we need to continue our education, because as industry gets more complicated, we have to stay one step ahead. So with that, Josh, are you ready to go?
Yes, sir. We got a number of questions chatted in, and I'll start off with one that all of the panel can take turns answering. And Dr. Moser, if you want to start, and we'll just start and go through the same way that you guys presented. How much weight is given to DNA sampling in the EPD evaluation and subsequently the indexes? And is there a preferred method of DNA sampling this participant wanted to ask?
Okay, Josh. Yeah, so a couple of questions there. First question was about how DNA information is incorporated. Of course, the DNA is going to be one of the sources that goes into the calculation of EPDs, along with the performance data on the animal, the pedigree information, as well as the progeny if we're talking about an older animal that's old enough to have had progeny of their own measured. And so that's going to be weighted depending on a number of factors, how heritable the trait is, how strong the correlation is between the genomic prediction and the trait. And so each of our associations each has their own methodology to incorporate DNA test results into the EPDs. And generally, the genomic tests will influence younger animals more and proven animals relatively little, because those younger animals, we don't have the benefit of progeny records to add accuracy to their EPDs. But for young animals, we see EPD accuracy going from the 0.2 range up to more around 0.4, in some cases a little higher than that, when the animal has had a high-density genomic test included. Then the question about sampling, I assume they're asking about collecting a sample of DNA to send into a lab for testing. And if that's the case, that each of these organizations may have different rules, but with Angus, that we take samples, either blood samples stored on a card, just a drop of blood placed on a special kind of paper that can be used. Doesn't have to be, just once it's dry, it can be stored and then sent in. We also work with hair samples, so usually tail hairs, and we need those hairs to be pulled, not cut, because we need the root. The easiest place to extract the DNA is in the root bulb of the hair, so we need those generally pulled out with a pair of pliers from the animal's tail. And then we can also work with semen samples as well if there's a bull that's been collected and we want to do a DNA sample on him.
Well, Josh, actually, yeah, Dan did a wonderful job of explaining it, and Herford is very similar. The genomic panel that we use today is specific to Herford. When we do a DNA test, it does affect all of the traits that we have, and as Dan said, that effect is dependent on the correlation of the genomic component to the trait, the heritability of the trait as well, and so how it would affect the dollar indexes obviously would be how much change you would see in that EPD, and as Dan alluded to, you'll see a little bigger bump in accuracy on the younger animals versus the older animals. Ours is used as somewhat of an index at the end. As Dan said, we do the same. We take the pedigree, the interim or performance information of the individual animal and the genomic component, and then obviously ultimately the big driver for the EPD trait is the progeny from the sires. And progeny at the end will outweigh all three of the other components. DNA extraction, we're basically the same. The largest majority of the DNA that we get is hair. And as Dan said, that's tail hair, and it's important that you collect it correctly by pulling upwards against the switch of the tail to make sure that you get that DNA at the end of the hair. And we also would accept blood cards. We would accept semen. And in some cases, we actually have a few breeders that are using some of the various tagging tubes to submit DNA. The interesting part of that, in all other cases, we can actually store some DNA. Those tagging tubes at this point, it's kind of a one-shot deal, not much storage time on those. So really very similar to what Dan has talked about, but just a few differences.
Yeah, so I'd reiterate what Dan and Jack have said. I guess I was listening to them and I kind of forgot. So the question, if I recall, Josh, was there something about asking if we put a different weighting on the indexes if we have DNA enhanced EPDs? Was that embedded in the question?
That's correct. How much weight is given to DNA samples in EPD evaluation?
Okay, so that's outside of indexes. I guess when I first heard, I thought one of the things I want to make clear is the weighting on the traits, as far as the index weighting on the trait, is independent of the accuracy of the EPD. The trait weightings are constants in whether or not you have a young bull that has very little data, a bull that has DNA, or a bull that has thousands of offspring as an AI sire. Those weightings on the economic weightings do not differ. But what Jack and Dan said earlier, as far as the impact on the EPDs, that no sense in me reiterating that because they laid that out quite well.
All right, we'll move to our next question. We have a lot of them, so I'm going to answer this one. Are these type of indexes used by the Red Angus breed? And I'll say yes. Most of our major beef breeds have incorporated indexes. Obviously, we couldn't let everyone speak tonight, or we never would have gotten finished. So we had to pick 3, and these are the 3 breeds we use. But you can visit redangus.org. They actually have a document right on their homepage, the Rancher's Guide to EPDs, that will explain more specifically what they do. Another interesting question we received, would you comment on the use of an economic index by a producer while simultaneously trying to select for individual EPDs, and what's your advice on handling those 2 different selection methods? Start with you again, Dan.
Okay, so generally my advice is that if there is an index that fits your situation well, and I think that's always the first step, is to look at the definitions associated with the indexes and make sure you have a reasonably good fit. Then I would make the index value my primary selection criteria, and then perhaps use the EPDs as a secondary source of information to do some fine-tuning, perhaps to tailor to your operation a little bit. But one of the nice things about the index is that because it's in dollars, it shows you very clearly, if you pass up on an animal, how much it costs you. If you have a bull that has a $3 advantage over your second choice, but there's something about that first bull you don't like, well, that's exactly how much it's costing you. It's costing you $3 per animal sired, and so you can see what is the cost. If it's something that's very important in your production situation, whether it's an EPD or even a visual thing, you can sure consider that. But I think that the index should be the primary selection criteria.
Josh, I would totally agree with that. I think at the very beginning of introduction to indexes, we had some breeders with that mindset. You know, when they looked at the relative weightings that we put on them for the various traits, they said, "Oh my goodness, I can't give up this." And so our comment, or my comment to them was, you know, do the sire sort by the index and find the bulls that fit your breeding scheme, as Dan said, and then if you want to put a threshold on an individual trait, then obviously do that within those dollar values that you sorted the bulls on. But I would reiterate what Dan said. If one of those bulls from an economic value standpoint are lower than some of the other bulls, it wouldn't make much sense for you to do that. But I also know the demeanor of some of our producers, and obviously there could be some individual traits within your herd that you feel like you need to make some change on and put some emphasis on. So sort them by the dollar values, and then if there is an individual trait, you can put a threshold on that somewhere.
Yeah, I'd say, well, Jack and Dan are right on the money. In theory and in other species, the indexes are given 100% credence for the most part. In the beef industry, you know, sure, we can go through and set thresholds, and we can take a look at other traits outside of the or beyond the index. And from a practical standpoint, there is some sense to that, because you can have, say you have a sire that is predicted to just set the world on fire as far as profit, but there's something about that sire that is just unacceptable to your customers. One example would be, you know, growth, because frankly in these all-encompassing indexes that account for cow herd, feedlot, packing plant, and so forth, you can have some sires that stack up pretty high towards the top that don't have a lot of growth, yet they can be predicted to be tremendously profitable. Well, the problem might be if your customers just flat can't accept a low level of growth. You know, it's not, if you don't get the genes of those bulls aren't in, you know, you don't get them into their cow herds, they're not going to do anybody any good. So from a practical standpoint, yeah, use the indexes heavily, and then go through and just kind of sort based on what you feel your customer base can accept. And I would my opinion is, as time goes on, we're going to see commercial cattlemen more willing to accept some things that in the past maybe were outside of their comfort level. For instance, lower growth bulls. So that's my 2 cents on that.
All right, Wade, since you've been at the tail end of things, we'll have a question that's geared more toward you. What about indexes for hybrid bulls? For instance, Sim Angus, is there a way to evaluate those currently, or do you guys see cooperation between breeds to lead to anything in that direction?
Yes and yes. We do have indexes on hybrid bulls. The way our indexes are constructed, the end product in both the cow herd and the feedlot and packing plant is a half British, half continental, and so we can, if you were to look at the hybrid bulls that we have in our database, and we have many, they all have index values, and those index values are predicated on using those bulls on a target cow herd that will result in a half British continental. So if they're half Gelbvieh Angus and you've got a half Herford Cital cow herd, you will have that target, and the index is going to be appropriate. As you move away from that, if you're looking at we have indexes on straight bred bulls of other breeds. For instance, we have indexes on Angus bulls. And as long as you're using those Angus bulls to produce a half British Continental calf, those indexes are going to be on the target. But if you're going to use those Angus bulls on straight Angus cows, the index they'll rank, like I said, these indexes are pretty robust, so they rank the animals pretty reasonably, but they're not going to be as on the mark as if you're making the mating that the index is designed to simulate. And then, yeah, working with other organizations, other breeds, that's certainly something that is in the mix, and we're very interested in that kind of thing. And like Josh just mentioned, Red Angus has an index, and we worked with them on that along with Mike McNeil, and we're very much a champion on trying to get indexes that are robust and work across populations and hybrids and so forth.
Anyone else want to comment on that? All right. Dr. Moser, we've got one directed toward you and the Angus, one of the Angus indexes. What do you believe, or is there any correlation in your mind between residual feed intake and $EN?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. We provide an EPD for residual average daily gain, which works very similar to residual feed intake, except that rather than predicting more or less intake at a constant level of growth, we're predicting more or less growth at the same level of intake. But they're both measures of efficiency and tend to rank sires fairly similarly. And so the question between that and the relationship between that and the Angus value $EN, and to kind of reiterate that $EN is a prediction of cow cost, but it's based on mature cow size, actually both weight and height are components of that, as well as milk production level. So there is somewhat of a relationship there because both of those traits, both residual gain or residual feed intake, are somewhat influenced by growth a bit. Probably not very much on the RFI side, but the $EN value, generally there are exceptions and of course bulls that defy all the antagonisms, but the general tendency is that higher growth is going to result in a little higher cow size, which is going to make $EN, the energy cost savings, go down. At this point, our $EN does not take into account any differences in measured feed intake. We have a substantial database of individual feed intake measures in the Angus database, but it's measured on growing cattle, yearling bulls, yearling heifers, and some steers as well. And we use that in our feed intake prediction, but we're still trying to quantify the relationships between growing animal intake and mature cow intake. There's a big project, USDA-funded project the University of Missouri is heading up that is looking into that, and as that's better quantified, we'll know better how we might incorporate some of our existing feed intake data into prediction of cow efficiency.
Excellent. Okay, we've got another question about indexes around fertility. What index for each breed would you most closely, or an EPD, closely reflect fertility in mother cows kept from a particular sire? And Dan, if you want to start off again, that's fine.
Yeah. So fertility in a cow is not one that we have that is not well measured. Some of the breeds have a longevity EPD. I know weight has a stability EPD, and so cow longevity would play into that. For heifer pregnancy, we have a heifer pregnancy EPD, and some breeds also use scrotal circumference as a predictor of age of puberty. There is some benefit on heifers calving earlier and then that carrying over into cow fertility, because when we have fixed breeding seasons, the heifers that calve earlier have more opportunities to breed back, particularly that first breed back that's usually the most challenging. So the heifer that calves earlier is going to be more likely to have more chances to get bred back and thus preg up bred when you get to palpation time. So for us, probably the heifer pregnancy EPD will have some impact. We're developing a database of cow inventory records, and with the idea that we'll have a cow longevity EPD that'll focus in on the fertility side of the cow part as well.
So Josh, at Herford, like Dan said, we have 3 of those indexes that we produce that are heavily weighted on fertility, because we understand that's truly the big driving force in profitability in the cow herd. If you don't get them bred, and obviously that if they don't calve, those are 2 things that are going to be pretty hurtful to your bottom line. And we put a lot of pressure on that right now in terms of scrotal. As Dan said, a very nice indicator of puberty, and because of that, has some effect on fertility, long-term fertility, because you get them bred early as calves. They kind of stay in the herd longer and have that potential. But we also understood that we needed to do a better job of predicting fertility, and as I mentioned in my presentation, we're now into the 15th year of whole herd reporting, and we are this spring actually finishing up the research and beginning to put into production 2 additional traits for fertility, and that'd be heifer calving rate and sustained cow fertility. And hopefully, well, not hopefully, it will at here later on this spring, when we get those 2 traits released, we will add them to the indexes to help shore up the fertility portion of those.
Yeah, this is an area that I think Red Angus can really take a bow. They were the first breed to introduce both, like Dan mentioned, he mentioned stability and heifer pregnancy, and they introduced both of those traits. They were also the first breed to go to an inventory-based reporting system, which is pretty much required to get good estimates of those 2 traits, heifer preg and stability. One of the things that's quite interesting is that any data that has been looked at in that area shows that heifer pregnancy and stability are not very strongly related. In fact, they're almost, at least the information, the data I've looked at, the genetic relationships are close to 0 between heifer preg and longevity or stability, which is defined once as the probability of a bull's daughter staying in the herd given that they've calved 1 time. And then heifer preg, of course, would be the probability of them calving given that they've been exposed the first time around. So they're definitely different traits. They're both economically important. In our index, stability is twice as important as the next closest trait, and heifer preg would be towards the higher end of the second tier, what I call the second tier of traits from an economic relevance standpoint. And the reason heifer preg is not as economically as important as stability is that with heifer preg, if you get heifers that don't stick, you can salvage them and still, get a high-priced product. They go back into the feedlot and can be fed out and sold as fat cattle. Whereas if you go through all the cost of getting a cow into production and then that cow fails, that is quite expensive, and of course the value is greatly diminished as well. Besides the fact that you've put substantially more money in that cow than you would just exposing a heifer calf. So, and we have had inventory-based reporting for quite some time. We have a stability EPD, and like I said, it's the most important trait in our API by a factor of 2. We do not yet have a heifer pregnancy EPD. We are working on that. We're working towards it.
Very good. Well, in the interest of everyone's time, we'll make this our last question for the panel, and we'll let Jack start this time, and then Wade, if you'd like to go second, and we'll let Dan wrap it up. This is around the mature cow size and moderating cow size question. If you're using the maternal indexes, do you feel like it will lead to a decrease in or a moderating of mature cow size? And in your opinion, in your breed, have cow sizes been moderating, you know, in the last few years?
Well, that's a great question, and yes, to the first part of it, if you use the maternal indexes, especially the balding maternal, the way the relative weightings are set, it does put pressure on mature size, and so I think over time that you can moderate mature cow size. But just as in any other trait, you don't want to go too far, and so we obviously, as Dan and Wade have talked about, an economically relevant trait of growth to the feed yard stage is important, but then we do want to try to keep our mature cows in check. So yes, you can because of the way the relative weightings are set. Specifically to Hereford, if you look at the genetic trend, I think for most breeds, growth has been astronomical, especially in our British cattle over the course of the last 20 or 25 years. And so our mature cow size has gotten rather large, and I would say that that's probably also happening in the commercial industry. The interesting comment that you hear around is everybody likes to have 11 or 1,200 pound mature cows in the commercial herd, but they probably haven't weighed them lately because they've probably gotten a little bigger there. So I think that is a big concern as we work with some of the larger commercial herds, especially in some of the high desert areas and some of those conditions. Trying to keep check on mature cow size is going to be important, and we have put that weighting on the traits of interest in those indexes.
Yeah, like Jack said, our API, which would be the index if you're going to keep replacement females that you would use for sire selection. So it does reward early growth. It does put a damper. It puts downward pressure on mature size. But the beauty of indexes are in this age-old argument, big cows, little cows, so forth. We don't really need to have that argument. The indexes take care of that, and you know, they will appropriately weight all the various traits that affect profit. And yes, there's no question. We know that mature size is related to what cows eat. So everything else held constant, smaller cows with lower intake are going to be profitable. But of course, in the real world, everything isn't held constant, and that's where the indexes come into play and weight all those things appropriately. And we have, there's no question that we've seen a decrease in mature weight. Of course, we needed to. I mean, we started Cital and a lot of continental breeds started from a point where we were excessive as far as mature size, and definitely curbed that. Probably, well, we know we haven't had the increase in early growth, the dramatic increase that Jack had spoke of in the British breeds. We have not. We've steadily increased growth, early growth, but a lot of the years over the last decade or so was very, very minimal as far as the increase in early growth. But again, that's something we probably had a fair bit of. So I think all in all, the index and our breeders have noticed that in using the API that they have seen a reduction in their cow size.
I'll to some extent kind of reiterate and talk about our Angus experience that with an index like $W, it puts down pressure on birth weight through selection for increased calving ease. It puts increased pressure on weaning weight, but then puts down pressure on mature cow weight. And so it is designed to through selection for $W, generate females that have a more desirable growth curve where their wean progeny still weigh well because of the early growth, but yet moderating the mature growth. So I think the index will do a good job of that. In our data, I was just looking at our genetic trends a little bit, and the Angus birth weight trend is down while weaning weight and yearling weight are increasing pretty dramatically. So we've documented that we can change the growth curve in these cattle. Mature cow weight is basically flat. We've seen a slight increase over the last 10 years. We've had mature cow weight, EPD, by birth year go up 5 pounds, but at the same time, yearling weight has gone up 26 pounds. So, and birth weight has declined at the same time as well. So with the use of multi-trait indexes like this, as well as just EPD selection using all the information, that it really has allowed producers to really redesign the cattle to change the growth curve and be inherently more profitable.
Well, thank you all for joining. We're going to wrap up now. I do want to remind everyone that the webinar is being recorded and will be available. Everyone that's been on the call will get an email within 24 hours with a link back to the webinar, and it will be available at beefusa.org tomorrow afternoon. Also want to ask participants to please fill out the survey. You'll get an email with a survey, and I think it will appear right here at the end of the webinar. So if you'll stick around and answer some questions, help us make these better in the future. Thank you to all of our panelists. We couldn't have done it without you. Y'all did a great job informing us on indexes and EPDs, and we really appreciate you joining, and hope everyone has a great night.
Thank you.